The pain of grief is real. The pain of grief is real. I'm taking steps to move on. I'm taking steps to move on. These are the words that I hear all of the time. And so I want to talk about it today and talk about how so many of us feel the pain of loss, but the pressure to move on. Let's talk about how we can empower ourselves to grieve effectively and to keep on living. Welcome back. My name is Catherine McNulty, and I get so many wonderful comments on my videos, and they're real and they're raw comments, and I love that so much. Please keep sharing what's going on with you. It helps in the healing of your grief. It helps me understand where you're at and create more videos that are really going to be helpful to you. But today I want to talk about this one particular comment, and it's a woman who says, I lost my spouse 4 months ago. And she went on to say that the pain is very real, but I'm taking steps to move on. And her words were short. But what happened for me is I thought of all of the words and all of the things that can be behind her comments. Now, I'm never going to know for sure because I haven't talked to her directly. But there's so much there and that I know you all can relate to. And so I want to dissect this a little bit and talk about it because I think it's very real. And I want to be able to give you tips to empower you. So if you are in a situation where you're feeling the pain of loss, but feeling pressured to move forward and to move on, let's talk about it. So first she says that the pain is very real. I think a lot of times we're surprised by the intensity of the pain that we experience, especially if we haven't lost a loved one before. And even if we have, and I've experienced this recently in my life, that every loss is a little bit different. And the magnitude of that loss can be different in different ways depending on who we've lost. Now, in this scenario, this woman lost her spouse. I don't know how long that they were married, but if you were married for 20, 30, 40 years and you lost a spouse, that pain is very real. And I think sometimes we minimize the pain that we're experiencing as if it's not justified. And I want to take a moment and ask you if you believe that your pain is justified. And I always say that the pain of your loss is in direct proportion to the amount that you love the person. And so when you think about the love of a spouse, the person that you've committed your life to, the person that you chose to marry and spend your entire life with, no matter how long or short that is a massive commitment. It is a massive amount of love that's required to go into a relationship like that, to commit to that kind of a relationship. And so the loss of a spouse, I think society sometimes minimizes it. And I know that if you're experiencing that feeling, that sometimes we feel pressured to move on, to get better, to heal, to keep moving forward. And when this person says, I'm taking steps to move on, I can hear an urgency in her voice, a feeling that it is our job and our responsibility to figure out all of this grief thing, to figure out our loss and be able to move on from it as if it didn't happen, as if it didn't affect us, so that we can go back to our being normal. And when I think about this, it's ludicrous to me. How can you choose to marry someone, spend your life with someone, have them pass away, and then just move on? Take a minute to process that, because I know that a lot of you put this pressure on yourself. And this pressure exists whether it's a spouse or a parent or a child or someone else that you love and that you've lost. There's a pressure to move on, to get over it. And today I want to support you in that and say that this is not something for you just to get over and just to move on. And I actually don't use the term move on because I don't think you can move on from a loss. I think you can move forward in loss because you have to figure out how to keep on living. That is what this channel is all about. The reality that you are still here, that you are still living. You have to figure out how to do this and how to keep moving forward on a daily basis. Oftentimes in ways that you can't comprehend and you don't know how to do. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the massive void that is in your life. How can you move on when there is this massive void? It's so overwhelming. It creates every emotion under the sun, whether it be anger, fear, depression, intense sadness from your loss. There's so much that's there. There's so much to process. And when we feel this pressure to just move on, what do we do with that? Well, we stuff it down, we avoid it, we act like it's not there, like we're not as effective, like we're okay. I'm fine. When people ask you, how are you doing? You say, I'm fine. If you've lost a loved one in the last year, in the last 2 years, you're not fine, you're grieving. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be okay, because absolutely you can do this. You can get through this. There is hope. It is the foundation of everything that we do here at Grief Inspired. But it is not to be minimized, and it is not something that you just move on from. Son, there is healing that continues. And when my father passed away a year ago, there are elements of my loss of my son that are coming to play in the grief of my father. I think that that's something that happens. So many of you have lost multiple people in your life. And so these things, they compound. And we have to process them in relation to one another. And I think things about your newer grief can teach us things about our older grief. And I think the vice versa is true, that you can take some of the learnings from an earlier grief. You can look and you can say, well, this is what I did well. Oh, these are some things that are popping up because, I haven't really dealt with them. And so I think that there's an opportunity that we have to continue to find a way to move forward and to keep on living, but not necessarily just to move on. And I think it's useful to note as well that there is no comparison. The normal human condition is to look at our grief and the way we're handling our grief and how we're going through our grief and our grief journey and compare it to someone else, right? It happens in my grief courses where one person's like, wait a minute, they're doing so well. They've had these awarenesses. They've had these ahas. They're not consumed by guilt anymore, right? Because we talk a lot about guilt and how to move forward, or maybe they've forgiven their loved one, right? Or maybe they've released their anger and let some of that go. And so it's a normal reaction to compare our grief and our loss and how we're doing and how much we're moving on or moving forward. But I don't think that that's really fair, because we all have to process our grief in our own way, and our experiences are different. And our traumas are different, and our triggers are different. And it's useful to note, I talk to siblings who have lost a parent. And I'm even dealing with this now with my siblings after the loss of my father. We grieve differently. And so there is really not a place to compare our loss to anyone else's and how well we're moving forward or moving on. I'm reminded of grief mantra number 2. You know that I have 10 grief mantras that are really the culmination of all of the things that I've talked about in my grief course over the years, and the things that I've learned, and the things that we need to remind ourselves of, or the things that are helpful, that if we can remind ourselves of these things, it makes the weight of grief a little bit lighter, and it helps us keep on living. And mantra number 2 is my grief is about my life. And so I want to remind you today that your grief is about your life. And as this woman says, the pain is very real. Yes, the pain is real. And she says, I'm trying to take steps to move on. Grief is about your life. How you choose to move forward, how you choose to lean into your grief, how you get your grief out. Your own grief. I want you to think about the progress that you've made. And as you go through the grief journey, take time to help yourself by tracking your progress. You know, it's one of the reasons why I love my grief journal, why I love journaling, because you can see how far you've come. You can see how you're releasing your pain, how you're processing, how you're letting go of some of the guilt, how you're giving yourself grace and forgiveness in time, because these are all the things that are required to heal our grief. And so whether you look back at your own journal, I highly recommend having a person that you can email what's going on, a place where you can share and be heard by someone. You can even email yourself as a way to track your own progress. Catalog what's going on with you. And when you look at the difference in your progress between 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, and beyond, what we sometimes don't notice is how we are moving forward. We're not moving on, we are moving forward. You don't have to be in a hurry. You shouldn't have to feel that pressure. Find a way to track what's happening with you so that you can know that you are progressing. It's the progress of grief that keeps us moving forward. It's what keeps us keeping on living. It's what reminds us that we are still alive, that we are still here, and that our loss, yes, involves our loved one, but our loss is so much more about our own lives than our loved one's death, of our own pending death, and the deaths of the people that we love. And I think that that can make us very sad, or it can make us stop and get curious and say, if I have a finite time on this planet myself, or if my loved ones have a finite time on this planet, how do I want to spend that time? How do you want to spend your time with your loved ones? Knowing that life is fragile, that life can end on a dime, that we may not be as prepared as we want to be for the loss of the people that we love. How can we prepare? Mantra number 2 is my grief is about my life. Write that down. Remind yourself of that today and keep on living.